Recording. So welcome to Sociology of the Family. I'm Dr. Beverly Yin Thompson.
And I'm Akello Stone.
And so in this section, we're talking about sexuality, chapter 6. So in order to focus specifically on sexuality from a sociological perspective, the chapter focuses on 3 different perspectives or sub-areas. And so those are identity, sexual behavior, and biology.
Biology, yeah. There's definitely a complex interplay between those.
The chapter does focus on sexual behavior, and that's a lot of what psychology would also focus on. And so it's interesting to talk about it sociologically, about how we talk about sexual behavior, but from a social institutions and power interaction kind of perspective.
Well, in the way in which those power dynamics and those macro level forces really do shape the way that people perceive themselves, as a sexual being, and the way they perceive others. And then we have things like, moral conformity, and we have religion, and we have obviously social institutions, biological reproduction, and also the idea of self-satisfaction. Yeah, because when you really think of sexual pleasure, there's a lot of different dynamics that could be emotionally fulfilling, but a lot of it is physically fulfilling, which then dips us into the biological aspect of sexual pleasure. But how does that find agreement or disagreement with the social context of the time? How you define yourself as a gender, perceive yourself, how other people perceive you, who you're attracted to is not, it's not a black and white thing. And there's a lot of, there's a myriad of things going on there. So it's almost too complex to study.
It's interesting because, as we saw in our gender chapter also, sometimes our social categories are more absolute and rigid than the actual reality that we see in the biological world.
So for many, it's not even until maybe late adolescence or even early 20s when they're able to really tap into, themselves and understanding themselves outside of the context of those rigid structures that you mentioned, that are imposed by the family, but it also imposed by the larger society onto the family, then onto the child. And it's almost the unpeeling of the onion skin in our own sexuality, if one is willing to explore that and they have the opportunity, because they're away from the family.
Right. So you have the biological aspects of whatever feelings and urges and behaviors one would engage in. But we live in a society, and then in each of these institutions are another layer on this onion that we have to peel back and understand. And so we're not just, animals responding out in the wild, but we behave in our cultural context of what's appropriate. And so the first aspect and institution that we learn about our sexuality is in our family, in our own family structure, and how that's mirrored in the larger society. And then we go to school, and we're interacting with our peer group and our authority figures, our teachers. And some people might in high school have a sex ed class or not. But then, in adolescence, people are learning about sexuality through the media, through the educational institution, through religion, of course, really has a powerful shaping pattern on the messages that we're told about how we're supposed to behave. Yeah. And sociologists are really focused on how institutions reinforce these norms through the power that they can exert on individuals' behavior. And so one of the important rules and regulations around this topic was that homosexuality and homosexual behavior was actually considered a mental disorder in the world of psychology until 1973, when it was removed from the DSM. And so that is a way in which we can see this power exerted. And also it's been criminalized. It's been criminalized through the state. And so, people face real repercussion in religions. Of course, we understand the power and how those are reinforced. Perhaps the church will only marry, certain types of conduct certain types of marriages and so on. So there's a real, it's not just a fear or a choice amongst equal options, but there's actual serious repercussions that people face. They can be rejected from their family, from this family institution, in educational institutions, in the military. We've seen rules against this kinds of behavior. And so it's really, people have real fears that will happen to them from these institutions.
I think what it also does is it really brings to light the fact that, our privacy is really compromised, because why would the public sphere have any say in what we do and how we do it? So when we talk about sexuality in that public sphere.
Right. And you can see, yeah, just if you have this normative family that conforms to the expected behaviors, then those folks, in their office can post a picture of their family, and they can have it on their shelf, on their Zoom
Right.
screen
Yeah.
behind them.
Yeah.
But if they have a non-normative family, then perhaps they move that picture out of the shot.
And where does someone who's asexual fall into that sphere? And they would probably still be perceived as heterosexual. Can you be asexual but homosexual? Like, can you be homosexual but never have sex? Is that still, that's where it really gets complicated, because you're definitely heterosexual unless proven otherwise.
Right.
And there's certain, once you've kind of crossed that line, there's no turning back. And I think that's where people, feel a sense of pressure to keep that their private business, especially if it's not in the context where that has any bearing on anything.
Right. I think about the bisexual activist Robin Oakes, who has this very complex diagram of sexuality and talking about different behaviors and feelings and fantasies, and just all these multi-level complexities, so that perhaps people feel more oriented towards or more attracted towards a certain gender in this context and less so in this context.
Yeah.
That it's very
Right.
complex, and that people can have these feelings and attractions, and perhaps they've never engaged in those behaviors. Perhaps they've engaged in those behaviors, but that doesn't reflect their real attraction. And so it's
Right.
difficult.
Right.
It's really important to understand where that person themselves is coming from and how they perceive themselves, rather than impose these categories from the outside and really flatten their experience. Because, and the chapter has a diagram on page 203 where they talk about how the differences between behaviors that people have actually engaged in and how they actually identify. And so, for example, we see that a lot more women have engaged in same-sex sexuality more so than men. But is that because it's biological, or is it cultural? Do women just have more freedom in our culture to explore in that ways? Or even just reporting. Perhaps more women are more open to reporting, and perhaps this is something that's more stigmatized for men and that they would report less of. But in this chart, we see that from people who've ever had a same-sex partner and then who identify as bisexual or homosexual, and then they've had a same-sex partner in the last 12 months, and that then the category of attracted to are mostly to only same sex. And so we see these percentages go down. People have engaged in a lot more behavior than what they actually define as their particular orientation and identity. And so, but especially if we think about bisexuality as a category, when society's viewing that, they often want to flatten it. Oh, this person is a man who's with a man, so they're gay, or they're with a woman, they're straight. But for a bisexual, it's more over time that, you have this identity. But it's difficult to reinsert that identity because people just flatten it to whoever you're with now.
Whenever they count people up and they have all these surveys, I was like, how come I've never been asked a survey about my sexuality or my sexual behavior, but to see that, you know, abortion, to see where abortion is in relationship to, you know, gay or, you know, gay sex, and like the degree of social acceptability, you know, when you say something is acceptable to some degree, if the context of what's happening in society says that something is socially acceptable, people may conform to believe that something socially acceptable, even though that's not what they really believe. You see
Mhm.
what I'm saying? So if something changes and we think that it is what it is, it's because people are giving the outward impression that they find something socially acceptable when they probably don't. And so I think that as you get older, I think as people get older and they get less and they feel less and less entrenched
Yeah.
in that the social pressure, they're a little bit more honest about what they really think.
So one of the things that the chapter mentioned is the studies that were done by Alfred Kinsey in the 1940s. And so he actually invited people into his office and met with people and interviewed thousands and thousands of people between him and his colleagues. And so he was able to really uncover um, that lots of people are engaged in so-called deviant sexuality that they wouldn't have admitted to in polite company, but lots of people had lots of secrets and were engaged in a lot more varieties of behaviors than we actually understood. And so this was just a landmark study based on human sexuality and what is actually going on in the American bedrooms.
Hello, I'm Dr. Alfred Kinsey from Indiana University, and I'm making a study of sex behavior. What's your most common decision?
There's more than one?
I've learned that the gap between what we assume people do sexually and what they actually do is enormous.
How young were you when you first experienced hugging?
Necking.
Petting?
What did you dream about?
That's why a study of this kind is so important. All we have is what people like you are willing to share with us.
Yeah, and even though that was that was a huge study, and there were certain methodological considerations that kept the person completely anonymous. There was like a coding system of how those answers were recorded. But there's also this kind of the idea of like self-selection. So if someone agrees to participate in a study, even though it's anonymous, they're still divulging information that there are many people out there that engage in behaviors, and once it's over, they remove it from their mind. They don't spend time thinking about it, let alone sharing it. So I think the numbers are even, and they really weren't. I think the Kinsey Institute wasn't really about looking at numbers conclusions. I think what it did was, at least from my interpretation, is it proposes understanding that there is a gradient of behavior and thoughts and behaviors. So, and whether or not someone, I think people should be able to identify themselves as they wish, not as someone else has determined them to be.
They mentioned that men have more sexual partners than women, and we see this reinforced by our cultural behaviors, that men are allowed socially to have more sexual partners than women, and women are stigmatized the more sexual partners they have, whereas men are valorized when they have more partners. And so therefore, when people report how many partners they have, that they're going to be thinking about these kinds of stigmas when they report their numbers as well.
This is the other thing too, though. Again, this is where people know that putting those kind of information, saying that kind of information, is problematic as a person, right? To like admit that that you don't fit the mold, and then be able to say it. Because if we never say it and think about it, even though we did it, it kind of didn't happen,
And they also talk about how sex without consent is relatively common. And they say 6% of women and 5% of men, when they were asked about their first sexual encounter, report that they really didn't want it to happen at the time. So many people, and this is 6% of women and 5% of men, are saying perhaps they were, when people enter into sexual behavior, usually, or perhaps it's with someone who's older, someone who with more experience, and they don't, the virgin doesn't really know what they're getting into, obviously. But those numbers are pretty equal, 6% and 5%. And then when we think about sexual abuse amongst children, boys and girls, the numbers are relatively equal. But when boys and girls grow up past adolescence, then we see this sex without consent, rape, sexual assault. The numbers really go way up for women and not as much for men, although it still happens with men. And we stigmatize and associate sexual assault as for male perpetrators against female victims. But by saying that and repeating that, then we obscure male victims and female perpetrators. And so it's important to say that, those situations also happen. And that points to the fact that this is more about power and domination. And so for male victims of sexual assault, they're going to really face a lot of stigma to come out about their victimization. And so it's very difficult for them to find support groups or to even be able to speak openly or to be able to prosecute their case.
Absolutely. I completely agree. And I think there has to be a dramatic change in the sexual socialization of men. Like, for example, there's people that believe that a woman could not sexually assault a man because if he gets erect, then he is kind of consenting to that, The other thing is the idea, as a man and growing up, like if a woman wants to have sex and you better have sex with her, you know what I'm saying, that you're being offered that. So there's almost like no choice. So I think there are times where men will have sex with women when they didn't really want to. I think that when that happens, then there's some way that negative feelings manifest themselves, and it may become violent. It may be, that might be kind of the roots of their violence and aggression towards women, if they felt that they, if someone imposes their sexuality on you, no matter who you are, man, woman, no matter what your sexual orientation is, and you do something against your will, there's a certain, there's a power dynamic that's at play. And most people, when they want to overcome, they try to overcome, let's say, trauma and abuse, or times when they were powerless, by then being the dominant, person. So we live in a culture, at least in the culture of men, where a man is not supposed to ever turn down a woman because it threatens his manhood if he says, I don't want to have sex with you, right? So I feel like that has to be addressed, and it's really not being addressed in kind of sex ed and things like that. Or, that's why I think that, in order to dismantle the patriarchy, we have to reach the men, and we have to change, we have to change and undo the socialization that continues.
We really need to focus on the issue of consent in our society. And at different time periods, like perhaps colleges have tried to implement policies about affirmative consent, really getting people to verbally agree to the behaviors they're engaged in, and so that there's less confusion around the issue of consent.
In the sexual act, if you will, there has to be communication, especially if it's a new partner, right? Like during the whole process of what is okay and what's not okay, right? And I think that women would feel less empowered to say, no, I don't do that. You know what I mean? It was almost like an all or nothing. Say, yeah, we can do this, but then, there are gradients along the way. And I think people, both men and women or whoever you're having sex with, I think there should be conversation integrated into the act, not just like this quiet, like, okay, boom, now we're going to do this. And, there's things that happen along the way. And I think people should feel comfortable along the way, because you know, and should be empowered to be able to say no at any point along the way. And that's part of the problem in the cycle of rape and violence.
Well, the chapter talks on page 214 about the pill. And so this correlates with the time period. They're talking about 1960. When we
Yeah.
talk about after 1960, people are engaged in sex for pleasure, basically, in our
Yeah.
society. And
Yeah.
so we can't deny the importance of the pill and contraceptives that have the role that these have played in American sexuality.
Absolutely. And it's interesting, you know, growing up in the 70s in a Catholic home, and like, you know, there's religious institutions back then that were really opposed to any type of contraception, because what it does is say, yeah, it's like admitting that's the pleasure of sex, number one, and also admitting that women get pleasure from sex, and if they can, you know, alleviate that stress, there's greater freedom.
The chapter also has a chart there on figure 6.3 where it talks about the different methods of birth control used from people age 15 to 44. And so we see that the pill is the most popular, closely followed by female sterilization, and then condoms at 15%. And so we see from this chart that the onus of the birth control responsibility, it falls upon women.
You know, with male sterilization, it's a very easy procedure, and it's basically, you know, prevents the sperm from going down a tube, right? I think many men resist that because I think they feel it's going to prevent them from ejaculating or having an orgasm, because I don't think, again, because of lack of sex education, I don't think people understand that, you know, there's different components to ejaculate, right? So then that becomes thinking that if a man becomes, you know, can no longer have children, there's like his manhood is compromised as well. So it kind of goes back to this, you know, the fragility of manhood in the context of reproduction. So like having to redefining manhood outside of reproduction, I think can change things drastically.
So the chapter talks about sex at different life stages. And so this goes back to the idea of understanding sex longitudinally. How does it change over a lifetime? They talk about adolescent sex and then sex at older ages. And so we see in our society that sex is becoming more important, especially amongst senior citizens and older generations in our society. But this is a topic that's almost that also retains some stigma, but it's very important to talk about sexuality and enjoyment at later stages of life, even beyond the reproductive ages.
You know, I think the thing that always gets overlooked in terms of this of sexuality of older people is our concept of being sexually desirable,
Mhm.
is very much aligned with youth and aesthetics and bodies, you know. And as we all know, as we get older, our bodies do change whether you like it or not. And for our society is almost, as you get older, you need to cover up more, and then no one wants to see you. You're less desirable.
It's interesting because our culture is very schizophrenic about sexuality, especially younger sexuality and then even older sexuality. We don't want to talk about senior citizens having sex, and we don't want to talk about adolescents having sex. So the chapter talks about sexuality and health, and they just reduce it down to two specific topics out of the vast array of topics that could be included in this section. And so they focus on sexually transmitted infections, and then they also focus on erectile dysfunction. And so
Yeah.
they focus on sexually transmitted infections, and this just really reminds me of sex education in high school, which might really just reinforce this kind of discussions of STIs as a way to make young people fearful of sex and to try
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
dissuade them from engaging in it. But really, it spreads more misinformation. and then which promotes more risky behavior. So this does a disservice to young people when we really don't educate them, factually about sexual behavior.
And so the sex ed is really comprehensive instructions so that teens can make, more informed choices, and it's not about influence. They're already influenced significantly.
Well, we see in figure 6.7 this gap that's developed, and it's quite striking because it demonstrates that in 1995, 81% of boys and 87% of girls were receiving instruction on birth control, compared to 2011 to 2013, where it drops to 55% and 61% respectively. And so this is quite unexpected that we're actually receiving less information now than we did in the 90s, even though in 1995, you didn't have the internet and so on, but we're actually seeing that within schools and public education in particular, that sex education is even less than it was, 10, 15 years ago, which is quite a striking statement.
And the thing is it's almost like if you were presented with, if someone is presented with certain content, let's say certain pornographic content, and that's all they've been presented with, they're going to formulate their sexual scripts on what they see, and they don't know any different. And in the case of, let's say, a heterosexual man and woman has sex, he envisions his role in sex based upon what he saw in porn, and then the woman may not stop him or even correct him because, you know what I'm saying, because of our social system. And so then it's a lose-lose situation for both, right? Because I don't necessarily think that men really always feel comfortable enacting what they see on porn, but they think that's what they're supposed to be doing.
So we actually see a situation where porn, as a media representation, as a fiction, is actually influencing real world behavior then by,
Absolutely.
reality, copying the media representation.
Absolutely. Especially in if people are just connecting on that sexual level, it's weird. It's stumbling blocks. There's a lot that has to take place between those two people, but I think it has to be that communication. People have to feel comfortable and affirm that they can communicate with one another along the way, and they both benefit that way. There has to be some freedom, and there has to be some conversations about that, like get to know yourself in that way, and you will find you'll find what works for you.
Well, so we've seen in this chapter that, sociologists can talk about sexuality in a lot of different ways. There's a lot of different topics, a lot of different ways that institutions influence our behavior. And so we've just touched on some of the surface topics of, all the things that we could talk about here.
Yeah, and like there's the development of the I and the me again with the sexuality, what we're told to do and what we feel like we want to do.
Well, thank you for joining me today in this discussion of sexuality in our Sociology of the Family class.
I know, thank you. I wish we had 3 more hours.